Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. A brief warning before we begin. Despite its focus on fairy tales, this episode is not intended for children or easily frightened adults. Listener discretion is advised. One day, Henny Penny was up picking up corn in the cornyard when, whack, something hit her upon the head. "Goodness gracious me," said Henny Penny. "The sky's a-gonna fall. I must go tell the king." So she went along till she met Cocky Locky. "Where are you going, Henny Penny?" says Cocky Locky. "Oh, I'm going to tell the king the sky's a-falling," says Henny Penny. "May I come with you?" says Cocky Locky. "Certainly," says Henny Penny. So Henny Penny and Cocky Locky went to tell the king the sky was falling. They went along, and they went along, and they went along, till they met Ducky Daddles. "Where are you going to, Henny Penny and Cocky Locky?" says Ducky Daddles. "Oh, we're going to tell the king the sky's a-falling," says Henny Penny and Cocky Locky. "May I come with you?" says Ducky Daddles. "Certainly," said Henny Penny and Cocky Locky. So Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, and Ducky Daddles went to tell the king the sky was a-fallen. When we were children, many of us remember opening a large, mysterious book filled with fantastical tales. Its dreamy pages were filled with beautiful illustrations from another time. We would stare at them in wonder for hours, even if we didn't understand the words. Whether it was a Disney storybook, a collection of Brothers Grimm tales, or a volume of mythic lore, there was something special and enduring about these books. Even today, parents place these massive tomes in the hands of children, letting them soak up the stories, unconcerned with what lies inside. And it wasn't just the books. Many of us also remember being parked in front of a television or taken to a movie theater to see the latest fairy tale film. Animated and live-action versions of the classics continue to be made, inspiring a new wave of nostalgia across generations. These stories are labeled family-friendly, and their themes seem to transcend time. They cut across social divisions and speak to children everywhere. No matter who you are or where you come from, we can all relate to something in a fairy tale. But behind these seemingly bright, cheerful narratives is something far more sinister. Something horrifying lurking just beneath the surface. In today's episode, we step into the dark and disturbing world of fairy tales. As we will see, it only takes a little scratching beneath their fantastical gloss to uncover something much, much darker. Review the subtext, deconstruct the lines on the page, or watch those films with a critical eye, and you begin to realize these seemingly lighthearted stories actually belong in the horror genre. The tales we have assembled for this episode and next are some of the darkest and most disturbing we have ever encountered, and we're no strangers to the dark and disturbing. Together, they leave us with a troubling question. How did something as dark as fairy tales become such a cheerful part of our childhoods? But before we get to that, March break is just around the corner, and we're running ghost tours and paranormal adventures all week long. Whether you're in Ottawa, Toronto, or Kingston, or will be visiting, we've got something thrilling waiting for you in the dark. In Kingston, the March break week also marks the return of our Ghosts of Queen's University tour. Visit hauntedwalk.com to find your next experience. As a thank you for listening, you can use the promo code HauntedTalks, all one word, to save 15% off your tickets. And if you're enjoying this episode, be sure to follow, rate, and review us wherever you listen. And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk for more spooky updates. Let's go back to the beginning. The fairy tale narratives we know and love today began to take shape a few centuries ago, but the concept of the fairy tale is far older than that. When reading and writing were skills largely reserved for the privileged class, most people shared stories by spoken word. They told all kinds of tales. Autobiographical stories about themselves or their families, legends that explained the unexplainable, moral tales meant to encourage obedience, and fantastical journeys told simply for entertainment. The most memorable stories were passed from one teller to the next, traveling far and wide as each person added their own details, meanings, or messages. This kind of storytelling was popular all over the world. But in the more densely populated centers of Europe, one branch of it began to stand out. This kind of storytelling, which later evolved into folk tales and eventually fairy tales, originated around family hearths and in the dark, dreary public houses and inns where the rougher members of society gathered. These stories served as playful distractions from difficult lives. They offered a way to poke fun at morality and religion, and to share a collective laugh at the expense of the noble class. But they also created space to explore more morbid subject matter: gruesome deaths, terrifying assaults, torrid affairs, and dark magic. Early fairy tales offered a familiar form of escapism, much like picking up a novel by your favorite author, or listening to a podcast from your favorite show, to step away from your own life for a fleeting moment. When fairy tales existed primarily as oral stories, the narratives were flexible and free. The teller's imagination could roam anywhere. A story could follow any fantastical path, then suddenly shift without warning. Something that likely became even more unpredictable when alcohol was flowing freely. To modern ears, many of these oral fairy tales can feel like loosely assembled fragments, without a clear narrative arc. Listeners who play D&D or other fantasy role-playing games may recognize that same fluid style of storytelling, where unexpected turns are shaped by the imagination of the dungeon master. Let's travel back a few centuries and see what we mean. Take the Italian fairy tale, The Flea. The story follows a king who raised and feeds a flea until it grows to the size of a sheep. He then has the flea skinned alive. With the skin in hand, the king devises a test. Whoever can identify its source will win his daughter's hand in marriage. The plan backfires spectacularly when an ogre correctly guesses it is flea skin. Forced to keep his word, the king sends the princess away to the ogre's home. There she is horrified to find the hovel decorated with the carcasses of his recent kills, dripping with blood and stinking of decay. Distraught, she confides in an old woman who happens to be passing by. The woman agrees to enlist her mystical sons to help, apparently with no strings attached. What follows is a surreal, almost mythic chase. As the ogre pursues them, the sons use their gifts to stay one step ahead. Soap becomes a blinding sea of suds. A stick rises into an impenetrable forest, and a single drop of water swells into a roaring river. The chase ends when the youngest son, a master archer, blinds the ogre with a single arrow. The brothers then close in on the wounded beast and chop off his head. You guessed it, everyone lives happily ever after, except the ogre. The turning point in the history of fairy tales came in the early 18th century. For the first time, oral fairy tales were written down in books and circulated more widely. Because only the privileged class could read and write, these stories were now being recorded, shaped, and manipulated by the upper classes. It marked a major shift for the genre. Stories once familiar to anyone in a ramshackle country pub were suddenly being recited in formal parlors and fashionable literary salons. Once they were fixed on the page and read out loud from text, the older oral tradition, where each teller could add their own flourishes and alter the course of the story, was fundamentally changed. Fairy tales would never be quite the same again. But, unsurprisingly, the lurid content remained. Apparently, the upper classes were just as interested in taboo and gruesome subjects as the lower classes. Even though some story arcs were cleaned up and the narratives became more stable, the edgy, darker undertones endured. A shared fascination with these themes crossed social lines and pointed to the enduring, universal appeal of fairy tales. Their characters remained strangely relatable, which may explain why some are still captivated by figures like Henny Penny. So they went along, they went along, and they went along, till they met Goosey Poosey. "Where are you going to, Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, and Ducky Daddles?" said Goosey Poosey. "Oh, we're all going to tell the king the sky's a-falling," said Henny Penny, and Cocky Locky, and Ducky Daddles. "May I come with you?" asked Goosey Poosey. "Certainly," said Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, and Ducky Daddles. So Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, and Goosey Poosey went to tell the king the sky was a-fallen. So they went along, and they went along, until they met Turkey Lurkey. "Where are you going, Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, and Goosey Poosey?" asked Turkey Lurkey. "Oh, we're going to tell the king the sky's a-falling," said Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, and Goosey Poosey. "May I come with you, Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, and Goosey Poosey?" said Turkey Lurkey. "Oh, certainly, Turkey Lurkey," said Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, and Goosey Poosey. So Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey all went to tell the king the sky was a-fallen. When fairy tales were first written down and circulated more widely, They also acquired their infamous name. In 1697, the socialite and author Madame d'Aulnoy published Les Contes de Fées, a collection of tales she gathered from the French countryside. The English term fairy tale was later applied to similar stories as a nod to her influence on the genre. She is also credited with introducing one of the genre's most enduring figures, Prince Charmant, or in English, Prince Charming. Madame d'Aulnoy's body of work does not feature the dark, gruesome tales that later came to define the genre. That would take another century, along with a healthy dose of German and English influence. Instead, Madame d'Aulnoy introduced other tropes that still endure in fairy tales. The importance of fidelity and sincerity, the hope of finding lost love, enduring bonds between women, and moral warnings aimed at children. She is also credited with helping bring themes of magic and fantasy into popular writing, and she would go on to inspire later fantasy writers. But she may be best known for shaping one of the genre's most enduring figures, the older woman driven by magic and revenge. The evil stepmother, the vengeful aunt, the haggard witch, these were her specialty. So the next time you hear an old woman cackling in a fairy tale before she unleashes her fury on the world, you have Madame d'Aulnoy to thank. If fairy tales got their name and some of their key characters from the French writer, they got much of their content, especially the darker overtones, from German folktales. Commonly called Märchen, which loosely translates to fairy tales, these stories more closely resembled the lurid oral tales told by the lower classes. Märchen could contain any number of themes, but most included some element of magic or mysticism. There were fantasy creatures like ogres and giants, and battles between good and evil. But there were also plenty of stories involving horrifying murders and brutal acts of torture, often ending with some kind of moral lesson. These moral lessons are one of the reasons fairy tales became so closely associated with children. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Märchen were meant for a broad audience. Although they were primarily shared by adults, children were present at the family hearth or in the local tavern and would have heard these stories too. But over time, as the moral of the story became the defining feature of fairy tales, children, especially those thought likely to stray or disobey, became the target audience. Take the familiar story of Hansel and Gretel. Though it has long since been sanitized, the original version, based on German folklore and later shaped into a moral tale for children, remains deeply disturbing. A poor woodcutter and his wife were facing famine, and they considered cannibalizing their own children. Instead of eating them, the wife urges her husband to lead the children deep into the woods and abandon them with only a few crusts of bread and a small fire. Hansel, however, has the foresight to leave a trail of pebbles as they walk, and the children manage to find their way back home. Their stepmother is furious and insists they try again. The next day, the family sets out once more, but Hansel is unable to take his pebbles. So, he uses crumbs from the bread instead. As the children are led deeper and deeper into the woods, the reader realizes the birds are eating the trail they are leaving behind them. All that remains is to read on in horror as the children are slowly led to their doom. The next morning, the children are lost and starving, and they begin searching the woods for food. Before long, they come upon a house made of cake and other treats. Unable to resist their hunger, they begin eating pieces of it. But the house is clearly a trap, and the old woman who lives there soon catches them. The reader quickly learns she intends to fatten them up before eating them. They escaped the grasp of one set of cannibals, only to find themselves fall into the hands of another. Hansel is imprisoned and fed constantly, while Gretel is forced to help around the house between large meals. At last, when the witch decides Gretel is ready for the oven, the young girl manages to shove the witch inside, slam the door, and burn her alive. The children escape their own cannibalistic fate, while the witch meets a gruesome end. By the early 19th century, the relationship between fairy tales and children had grown even stronger. More people could read, and education was becoming common even in working-class homes. Print media was more available to the masses, and the old oral tradition of storytelling was gradually fading. The written word was seen as permanent and stable, something to be passed on verbatim, unlike the oral storytelling, which was always open to change. Most importantly, print media became a tool for educating children and teaching moral lessons. Around this time, the classic Cornish tale of Henny Penny was written down for the first time. So they went along, and they went along, and they went along, until they met Foxy Woxy. And Foxy Woxy said to Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey, "Where are you going, Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey?" And Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey said to Foxy Woxy, "We're going to tell the king the sky's a-falling." "Oh, but this is not the way to the king, Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey," says Foxy Woxy. "I know the proper way. Shall I show it to you?" "Oh, certainly, Foxy Woxy," said Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey. So Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, Turkey Lurkey, and Foxy Woxy all went to tell the king the sky was a-fallen. It was during this rise of print media and children's moral education that the Brothers Grimm enter the picture. They set out to collect German folktales and compile them into a single volume that could circulate far and wide. Their mission was to preserve these stories before they were lost or forgotten in the rapidly industrializing urban cities of Europe. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of Romanticism, a movement driven by a longing for a simpler time when people lived off the land far from grungy factories. The Brothers Grimm and other fairy tale writers helped create timeless classics set in a distant past, in indistinct places, with events that could resonate across generations. The Brothers Grimm produced the most widely known collection of fairy tales in modern times. If Madame d'Aulnoy was the grandmother of the genre, the Brothers Grimm set the standards for centuries to come. Everyone knows at least one Brothers Grimm tale, from Hansel and Gretel to Sleeping Beauty to Rapunzel and Little Red Riding Hood. Their collection of folk tales is so significant that it is included on the UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. The Brothers Grimm also popularized familiar tropes in horror writing long before the popularization of the genre, including the concept of the forbidden room, where something magically evil is stored away. A well-known fairy tale example is the Enchanted Rose in Beauty and the Beast, hidden away in the mysterious west wing of the Beast's castle. But a much darker forbidden room appears in Fitcher's Bird, a variation of the classic Bluebeard tale. In this story, a sorcerer disguises himself as a beggar to lure in young women who take pity on him. After trapping them in his home, he orders each woman to carry an egg at all times as proof of her fidelity. While he is away, they are free to roam anywhere on his vast estate, except for one single forbidden room. One by one, they give in to temptation, perhaps under the influence of the sorcerer's spell. Inside, they are met with a grisly sight: the dismembered bodies and skeletons of the women who failed the same test before them. In their shock, they drop the egg, revealing their betrayal to the sorcerer. He swiftly murders them and adds each new victim to the horrifying room. One day, he ensnares another young woman. Unbeknownst to her, her two older sisters had already been lost in that house of horrors. But this young woman was more cunning. When she finally gave in to the temptation of entering the forbidden room, she left the egg outside. Though the scene is grotesque, the tale suddenly turns magical. She gathers the scattered body parts of her sisters, sets them back in place, and in true fairy tale fashion, they come back to life. When the sorcerer returned home, he found the egg still intact and remained unaware of her deception. So, he proposed marriage instead. Through a series of clever tricks with the help of her newly revived sisters, the young woman found a way to escape the sorcerer's home, disguised as a golden bird, a transformation she achieved by drenching her body in honey and rolling in the down of a slashed feather bed. When the sorcerer returned, intending to marry the young woman as a reward for her supposed fidelity, the three women locked the doors and set the house ablaze, burning the sorcerer and all his wedding guests inside. The house that was built to trap women became, in the end, the sorcerer's own cage. It was expected that young readers might come across Fitcher's Bird, but the tale was certainly not written with them in mind. As more and more children began reading these stories, authors started tailoring their tales for younger audiences, especially those thought to be in need of lessons about morality and proper behavior. Think of Goldilocks, a 19th century English story that appeared in several versions featuring women of different ages. Over time, the version that endured was the one we know today. A rather naughty young girl breaks into the cottage of a family of bears. Many authors had lofty intentions when shaping these stories, believing their young readers would benefit from clear moral lessons, as the writers behind Henny Penny did. And so they went along, and they went along, and they went along, till they came to a narrow, and dark hole. Now this was the door to Foxy Woxy's cave. But Foxy Woxy said to Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey, this is the short way to the king's palace. You'll soon get there if you follow me. I will go first, and you come after. Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey. Why, of course. Certainly. Without doubt. Why not? Said Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey. Other authors were far more deliberate in disturbing young readers. Take Carlo Collodi, the Italian author of Pinocchio. Many of us know the Disney version of the classic puppet who longs to become a real boy, but is burdened by a peculiar affliction. Every time he lies, his nose grows. In that version, the puppet is mischievous and often finds himself in difficult situations, but the story remains sweet and endearing. In the original, however, Pinocchio's behavior is anything but cute or lighthearted. Collodi describes the puppet in almost demonic terms, calling him a disgrace, a rascal, and a rogue, something closer to an evil Chucky doll. Eventually, the puppet's bad behavior leads him to being bound, noosed, and hanged from the branch of an oak tree. In loose translation, the original ending reads, "His breath failed him, and he could say no more. He shut his eyes, opened his mouth, stretched his legs, gave a long shudder, and hung stiff and insensible." For the reader, there is some grim relief in knowing that the evil puppet died. He had earned it. But the image lingers, a thing built for play and laughter, dangling from an oak branch, enduring the cold reality of human execution. It is the horror of a child's final breath, trapped inside a body that can neither scream or open its eyes. The story was so popular, though, that Collodi was forced to revive the character and publish more parts to the story. We could excuse Collodi if he was writing for an adult audience, and children happened to come upon the disturbing tale. But Pinocchio was created exclusively for children. So, what happened to those gruesome fairy tales? In part, we can blame the rise of modern film. Early animated movies, most famously those made by Disney, looked back to classic storytellers like the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen for inspiration. The darker versions of these stories were still circulating in books, but they remained hidden behind a veil of words and careful illustrations. A child's imagination had to do the work of turning those words into nightmares. Animation changed that. It meant making some of those horrors visible, which created a challenge for early filmmakers. Reading about a puppet hanging from a tree was frightening enough for a child, but showing the same image on the screen was something else entirely. So the stories were softened in adaptation. Bambi's mother still dies, but she is not tortured. The bones of these tales, it turns out, are harder to remove than a glass slipper. Think of Cinderella, the classic rags to riches story of an abused stepdaughter reduced to servitude, who is eventually chosen by a prince through an anonymous shoe-fitting test. The original Brothers Grimm version is very similar to the familiar Disney plot, with only a few details removed. At the end of the story, for instance, When the evil stepsisters try on the shoe left behind by the mysterious young woman, they are determined to make it fit. Disney shows the sisters unsuccessfully forcing their large feet into the slipper. The brothers Grimm, perhaps unsurprisingly, take a darker approach. One stepsister cuts off her big toe to force the shoe onto her foot. The prince discovers the deception only after blood from her missing toe soaks through her white stocking. The other sister cuts away part of her heel, but the prince is not fooled a second time. Once Disney entered the picture and film became the dominant medium for fairy tales, the most disturbing elements of the stories began to fade. But the baseline of most fairy tales has remained the same, even centuries removed from their gruesome origins. Stepsisters may no longer be mutilating themselves, and children's stories may no longer dwell so openly on grotesque violence, incest, and bodily horror, but we still tell fairy tales with deeply dark foundations. Early storytellers were already brushing up against horror long before horror writers formally entered the scene, and they left behind some of the most astonishing gore we have ever encountered. If anything is certain, it is that tales we learned as children should still haunt us today, especially the conclusion of our beloved Henny Penny. So Foxy Woxy went into his cave, and he didn't go very far, but turned around to wait for Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, Ducky Daddles, Goosey Poosey, and Turkey Lurkey. So, at last, Turkey Lurkey went through the dark hole into the cave. He hadn't gone far when Foxy Woxy snapped off Turkey Lurkey's head and threw his body over his left shoulder. Then, Goosey Poosey went in, and off went her head, and Goosey Poosey was thrown beside Turkey Lurkey. Then, Ducky Daddles waddled down and snapped Foxy Woxy, and Ducky Daddles' head was off, and Ducky Daddles was thrown alongside Turkey Lurkey and Goosey Poosey. Then, Cocky Locky strutted down the cave, and hadn't gone far when Foxy Woxy and Cocky Locky was thrown alongside of Turkey Lurkey, Goosey Poosey, and Ducky Daddles. But Foxy Woxy had made 2 bites at Cocky Locky, and when the first snap only hurt Cocky Locky, but didn't kill him, he called out to Henny Penny. But she turned tail, and off she ran home. She never told the king the sky was a-fallen. Thank you for joining us for this episode. In our next show, I'll share a reading of one of the most disturbing fairy tales ever written, a tale of revenge, murder, and a voice calling out from beyond the grave. We would love to be a part of your March break plans. Please visit us at hauntedwalk.com for information about all of our ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. And don't forget to use the promo code Haunted Talks, all one word, at checkout to get 15% off your tickets for listening. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this very dark episode, and to Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, be very careful which stories you're reading to your kids before bed, and sweet dreams.